Hi and welcome to my first video that will form the basis of my series in astrology. I'm going to be looking at astrology from the deepest aspect I can, which will be the spiritual aspects of astrology, and I'm going to work from the ground upwards. So we'll look at planetary glyphs first. So astrology can be used in terms of the price of gold, stock market variations, location astrology, all sorts and different aspects and spheres of life. But in line with my teachings, or in line with the tutorials on tarot and the rest of my website, we're going to be looking at the more spiritual aspects of astrology. So we'll look at the planetary glyphs here. They're made up of 4 different shapes, the first being the circle, which essentially represents spirit. You could say that God has an infinite circumference because he is everywhere. He's infinite, he has no boundaries, no edges. And it's embracing all of creation. The second shape associated with planetary glyphs is the semicircle. And we can see, if we think of this as a bowl, it's essentially a receptive vessel open to life's lessons, and it represents the soul. The third shape is the cross of matter and the fourfold nature of matter with the 4 elements, which is pragmatic, grounded in physical reality, and or stuck there. And indeed it was the crucifixion and Jesus going beyond the limits of matter into spirit, which was the basis of Christianity. And the final shape we have is the arrow, which we see in the glyph of Mars, and that's representing a direction of energy. Now, strictly speaking, the Sun and the Moon are not planets, but we include them in our study of the glyphs because they form important parts of who we are astrologically. So the Sun is represented by that circle, but with a dot in the centre, and the circle represents spirit, as we have said, with God being represented by an infinite circle, all-encompassing. So the dot itself represents like spirit incarnating into matter, is that spark of God residing in all of us. And the sun represents our basic identity, and it's coloured first by the sign that it occupies at birth. So, for instance, we have like the incarnation of the soul from God, that divine spark going into the individual, and that individual vessel, if we take that dot, so I've taken that dot there and I've coloured it red. So if someone's born, for instance, under the influence of of Aries, which is a fire sign, then our basic identity here would be symbolised by the red colour, and all the other aspects of the chart would take this red colour and it would be blended by all the different energies in the chart. But essentially our basic identity would be Aries if the sun was in the sign of Aries at our time of birth. So hopefully that gives you some idea of the glyph of the sun. We now move on to the moon, and as you can see, its glyph consists of the double crescent lines. So we have a high degree of receptivity, and this can be both a strength and also something which just imprisons us. It can be a strength because this high level of receptivity, if channeled in the right way, can harness things such as psychic ability, intuition, being in touch with your feelings and being able to express them. But on the downside, because of this high level of receptivity, if we are in a difficult phase of life, then its energies can just entrap us in matter. So the moon is to do also with deception, and therefore it can be a prison for the personality if it becomes essentially ruled by emotions which are out of control. And this is what we saw in the old werewolf movies, where we had the wolf out at the full moon, and it's that basic instinct that can override the divine within us and entrap us in our lower nature. So the moon really has a double-edged sword in a way, and where it is in the chart is actually very important in how we express our feelings. Next up is Mercury, and we can see that the glyph of Mercury contains the three symbols of spirit, soul and matter. So we have a communication here between the soul, spirit and matter, and that communication is the form of the higher mind speaking and communicating with the lower mind to bring forth realizations. And where Mercury is in the chart, in what star sign is in the chart, colours the type of communication that we express. It might be easier to think of this if we look back into mythology, and we can see that Mercury was the winged messenger between the gods and man. So he had this communication between God and man going on, and this integration of higher and lower self enabled man to live a more harmonious life. So we'll move on to Venus next. So next up is Venus, and I talked a lot about this planet in the previous tarot card tutorial that I did on the Empress, because Venus rules the Empress. So we have the circle on top of the cross, so we have spirit above matter. In its highest form, it's universal love, it's that uniting principle. And if we look at the glyph of Venus on the Tree of Life, we can see that it unites all of the 10 sephira from top to bottom, from spirit to matter. So it's that universal love and that harmonization that happens with this planetary energy. But as I also mentioned in the tarot card, it can be a source of just getting lost in matter. The potential there is because it does attract beauty. That beauty can be skin deep. For instance, it's that person we've fallen in love with because we just find them so attractive on the outside that we lose track of what they are on the inside. I'm sure we've all been there. So Venus also has in its lower expression, it's very good at getting us trapped in matter, but from the spiritual point of view, the circle is above the cross and not below it. So we now move on to Mars. Mars is our next planetary glyph, and it is the circle with the arrow coming from the side and pointing upwards. And it can represent the spear and shield of Mars, the god of war. And we see him here, and it really represents, or the arrow represents, the willpower. So Mars is very different to Venus. Venus tries to overcome matter by showing you the uniting principle. Although, as I mentioned, the downside to that is that you can just get lost in the beauty of creation and not really see beyond the separate parts. With Mars, we have this directed willpower to overcome the limitations of matter. So, and this willpower comes from spirit that we see here with the circle, and the arrow points upwards because ultimately it's trying to attain a greater sense of awareness. So Mars is all about conquering and overcoming our limitations through directed willpower. So you can see Mars and Venus are two quite different energies. So we'll next move on to Jupiter. Jupiter sees a sort of semicircle emerging from the cross of matter. So Jupiter indicates the soul. As we said, the semicircle was the soul. Arising out of the limitations of matter. And this particular planet is to do with philosophy and our aspiration. And where Jupiter is placed in the chart is where we look for wisdom and understanding. So looking at this glyph, it's the experiences of matter, in other words, our worldly experiences, that we lift up, and we're able to use that and gain wisdom and understanding to help our soul evolve in a spiritual way. So that is the essence of the glyph of Jupiter. Next up, the glyph of Saturn, and as we can see, the cross of matter is above the crescent shape, which was symbolic for the soul, whereas in Jupiter we have the crescent surmounted on the cross, the crescent representing the semicircle or the soul. This gives us the soul being under the influence of the laws of matter, with Saturn being known as the lawgiver, imposing its rules and structures on our life. Also with Saturn, the crescent here is pointing inwards, whereas in Jupiter we've got like an open, outwardly pointing crescent. And this allows Jupiter to have the expansion of the soul here, reaching out and upwards, whereas Saturn is more restricting. And it can be said that it's possibly representing being burdened down by the weight of worldly responsibilities. But I'll talk more about these two planets in a forthcoming video. Next we have Uranus. The planetary glyph for Uranus is this shape with the two semicircles on the side of the cross, and you have both surmounted on top of the circle. So the cross surmounting a circle is the spirit under the laws of matter. The two crescents here is the soul striving for freedom from the restrictions in order to establish balance, and that's the restrictions of matter. So it's going beyond the restrictions of Saturn. Uranus is the most eccentric of the planets. It actually lies on its side and spins in orbit on its side as compared to the which makes it stand out from the rest of the planets. Materially, it can be quite a destructive time, but it's often useful to help the soul evolve. That said, I've said that it illuminates or shatters with little regard really for the havoc that's left in its wake, so it can signal like revolutions and that sort of thing. The seeking of freedom, inventions, things coming out of nowhere, they're all the soul breaking through the limits of matter. So it's about breaking out of those boundaries that were imposed by Saturn. So we'll move on to Neptune next. Next we come to Neptune, and this is the first time that we've had like this upward pointing crescent since we saw the glyph of Mercury. This represents the soul above the cross of matter and open to the inspiration of spiritual light and spirituality. So it's about the dissolving of boundaries, which spiritually is a good thing, because spirituality is all about finding the unity behind creation. But it can also work in the world as well by dissolving marriages, relationships, and anything that we know. So there are pros and cons to whether this is acting in a supportive, gentle way, or whether it's going to be a traumatic event that is happening. Also, with regards to money and things like that, it's not the best thing to have. You really want to be under the influence of Saturn for something like that. So Neptune is a very spiritual planet, but that energy needs grounding somewhere. So finally we move on to Pluto. Our final planet, which has been downgraded, I think, to a dwarf planet, is Pluto. I've said that Pluto represents tough karma. We've got here the crescent or semicircle of the soul, upwardly receptive to spirit. So we've got some spiritual evolution going on there, but there is a price to be paid for it in terms of Pluto. By house, the position of Pluto in the chart shows where individuals search for truths and deeper meaning. But the sting in the tail with this is that this crescent shape here is very much joined to matter, and quite often, in order to move away from this bondage here, Pluto brings about rather disruptive and aggressive change and transformation in someone's life. It almost comes along when we haven't done the work we should have done. Pluto comes along and forces the issue. It's a lot more concrete than Neptune, which is far more subtle and nebulous in its actions. So I said Pluto brings radical transformation and or upheaval of the soul, breaking free from matter to connect with spirit here. Don't forget, Pluto was god of the underworld, and so Pluto involves that part of us, that deep psyche part of us, and bringing that up to the surface for the soul to evolve into and understand spirit. And on the negative side, it can relate to even physical imprisonment, institutions, that sort of thing. So Pluto is very much a shifter by force in the chart. But obviously that can be modified if it's aspected to other planets. Okay, that concludes this brief introduction to the planetary glyphs, and hopefully that has given you some new insight into the spiritual aspects of the 10 planets.